The Mexican-American War is in a very important time in the United States history and in Mexico's history. We see that Mexico gained its independence in 1821 from Spain after a revolution and armed conflict, which lasted over a decade. But while Mexico were triumphant in the revolution, it left Mexico in a state of chaos. Mexico, as we know it now, is not the Mexico from 1821. At the time, Mexico was a larger nation. It was a nation that was stretched out, and it was a nation that was so large, it was almost around 4.5 million square kilometers. If we see the how large Mexico was, we see that there's going to be problems that are caused, and problems there were. There was instability in the state of Mexico and the government of Mexico. A weak government that it went from an empire to republican to powers being shifted back and forth and corruption eating up Mexico's government. Mexico had faced threats of emergent internal rebellions and invasions of Spanish forces from the bases in nearby Cuba. This government was characterized by instability, and it was ill prepared for the internal conflicts that will happen soon about when America decided to break out after 2 decades in 1846 and engage into war. United States here at this time were in an era of manifest destiny. They believed that it was the United States' destiny by God in order for them to expand their nation and expand their borders. We see that at this time that the United States have expanded from 13 colonies to now expanding itself after the Louisiana Purchase. And now their eyes were towards the recapturing of Oregon, annexing Texas and bringing them into the Union. And their eyes were towards California. And one person in particular that has his eyes on California, New Mexico, and the rest of the United States Southwest was President Polk. A very important figure in this conflict also was Antonio Santa Anna at this time. At this time, Texas had declared itself as an independent territory, independent state from Mexico. This began to shift and cause conflict within Mexico and the United States as the United States looked to gain Texas as another state. But due to the internal conflicts of the United States at the time between the North and the South, the Texas never entered into the Union until 1850. But if we see Texas at this time and we see the borders of Texas with the United States and Mexico, Texas played a very important role in the whole Mexican-American War. As while the refusal of the United States in order to bring Texas in as a state at the time, it grew tensions between Mexico and the United States as Mexico viewed Texas still as a territory of their own, but the United States did not recognize it, and they began to invade it and invade other parts of the country. The first battle we see here is the Battle of Palo Alto from May 8th, 1846. It was the first major battle between the Mexican-American War, and it was not far off the U.S.-Mexican border in Texas, as we said. But by May of 1846, a series of skirmishes had flared out an all-out war, and we see that Mexico would lose this battle. The next important battle was the Battle of Risca de la Palma, May 9th, 1846, as General Arista from Mexico would lay an ambush along the creek bed with a great deal of dense vegetation in hope to limit the visibility and limit the effectiveness of the American artillery and the American forces. It did work. The artillery was not much of a factor, but still the Mexican lines did not hold against a determined assault, and the Mexicans were forced to retreat to Monterrey, where their next battle would occur. It was the Battle of Monterrey, September 21st to 24th, 1846, where General Taylor would march into the Mexican north. Meanwhile, Mexican General Pedro de Apula had heavily fortified the city of Monterrey in anticipation of a siege. Taylor, defying conventional military wisdom, divided his army and attacked the city from two sides at once. And the heavily fortified Mexican positions had a weakness, and General Taylor would defeat them one at a time. The next important battle was the Battle of Buena Vista, February 22 for 23, 1847. After Monterrey, Taylor pushed southwards as they made as far as Saltillo. Here he would have troops reassigned to plan a separate invasion for Mexico from the Gulf of Mexico. And Mexico General Antonio de la Santa, as we mentioned before, decided a bold plan where he would attack and weaken Taylor instead of turning to meet this new threat. The battle was a fierce battle, and it was probably the closest it came for the Mexicans winning a major engagement. But it was a war in the West where we see that from President James Polk that the object of the war was to acquire Mexican northwestern territories, including California, Mexico, New Mexico, and much more. And when war broke out, he sent an army westward under General Stephen Kearny to make sure that these lands were in American hands when the war ended. The siege of Veracruz was a very important time in this war, where we see that the United States opened up a second front against Mexico, and they landed near Veracruz and marched onto Mexico City in hopes of ending the war swiftly. In March, General Scott oversaw the landing of thousands of American troops near Veracruz on the Mexico's Atlantic coast. And it was the Battle of Cerro Gordo in April 17 and 1847, where we see Mexican General Antonio de Santa had regrouped after his defeat at Buenavista, and marched with thousands determined to invade the Americans. But foolishly, Santa Anna ignored the reports, and it left his left flank vulnerable, and the Americans attacked from there, and General Scott exploited his weaknesses. The Battle of Contreras in August 20, 1847, the American army under General Scott made its way in the inland towards Mexico City. The next series of defenses was around the city itself. After scouting the city, Scott decided to attack it and gain victory. The Battle of Churubusco in August 20, 1847 was a very important one, as was Valencia's force defeated due to the previous battle. The Americans now turned their attention to this city gate, and once again gained the victory and were positioned to threaten Mexico City itself. The Battle of Molino del Rey was a brief artistic battle between the two armies. Scott resumed offensive operations on September 8, 1847, laying a heavily fortified Mexican position at Molino del Rey. But Scott assigned General William Worth to take attacks and fortify the old mill. Worth came up a very good battle plan, which protected his soldier from enemy cavalry reinforcements while assaulting the position from both sides. But once again, the Mexican defenders put up a valiant fight, but were overturned, and once again the United States have won. Was Molino del Rey now in Americans' hands, and after several battles that the Americans won, they were in prime position into the heart of Mexico City, a fortress on top of Catulupec Hill. The fortress was also Mexican military academy for many young cadets that fought in its defense. And after a day upon the hill, with cannons and mortars, Scott sent parties with scaling ladders to storm the fortress. 6 Mexican cadets fought valiantly to the end, the Nino heroes, or the hero boys, that are honored into Mexico into this day. Once the fortress fell, the city gates were not far behind. By nightfall, General Santa Anna had decided to abandon the city and those soldiers he had left behind. Mexico City belonged to its invaders, and Mexican authorities were now ready to negotiate and had ready the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where both governments agreed and to end war, and now the terms of the agreement were now settled. The Treaty of Hidalgo was approved in May of 1848, where both governments agreed to sell several parts of Mexican territories to the United States. These territories included California, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and East Colorado, including Texas. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848 is a very important treaty, as we see that it was sold for $15 million. This $15 million was half the price where originally the United States, before the war, wanted to buy these certain lands. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo shows us of how valiantly the Mexicans fought, but how victorious and triumphant the United States were. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo shows how monumental the United States era of manifest destiny was. They continued to expand west and they continue to spread their ideals and their cultural beliefs, and believing that it was God's destiny for them to expand and have so much impact and influence amongst other nations and cities. The Mexican-American War will always be remembered for the victoriousness of the United States, the strength, the pride, and the patriotism that the United States showed during this war. While the Mexicans lost great chunks of territory, they didn't lose their whole nation, as it was talked at a certain point that if it was not better for the United States just to annex the whole Mexican nation. But the United States saw the mistakes that Mexico did once it conquered its independence from Spain in 1821, and did not want to repeat the same mistakes. And while the United States continued to expand, and in modern day we see that the United States continues to expand, but not its borders, but its impact and its influence, its ideas, its political beliefs, and its moral beliefs, its ethic values. The United States till today shows that manifest destiny will continue to live on, no matter how much opposition there may be. The United States will continue to expand its influence and its impact, regardless of its borders. But understanding that Mexico, because of this, were left in a chaotic state where corruption and a weak government is still established and never recovered from this war.